This is the Maldives. By population, almost all of it, in one frame, on one island. 241,000, or 42% of the country's 579,000 citizens live here in the capital, Male. With just about 2 square kilometers of land, it's the 9th most densely populated island of any size on Earth. There's hardly enough space to work, shop, or play, much less land. Which is why the Maldives' only international airport is entirely located on a separate nearby island. In 2017, 1.4 million tourists visited the country, well over twice its permanent population. But every last one had to either take a ferry to Male or a seaplane or boat to another island. Clearly, the Maldives needed a bridge. And who better to build it than the source of nearly a quarter of its tourists at the time? The lifeblood of its economy, China. So that's exactly what happened. In 2018, this 4-lane bridge was finally complete, turning what was a scheduled ferry ride into a quick 5-minute drive. It was an instant quality of life improvement for a huge portion of the entire country. And there was no mistaking where it came from. In addition to being named the China-Maldives Friendship Bridge, it was even written in Chinese. Neither was this China's first engagement with the country. Back in 2014, Chairman Xi Jinping even visited the archipelago, becoming the first Chinese head of state to do so. Its state-owned companies also lent the funds to build 11,000 high-rise apartments, upgrade its power grid, and expand its airport, among other things. Yet, despite these very tangible developments, public perception of China's investment in the Maldives is today overwhelmingly negative. These loans have been criticized by the current administration as being far too expensive. Only recently did the scale of debt become public, amounting to what appears to be $3 billion in total, not much smaller than the entire national GDP. As you can see, for all the allegations of China's checkbook diplomacy, the actual results are quite mixed. Most countries are somewhere in the middle, or only slightly positive. Here you can see the sentiment toward Chinese loans in countries receiving them, and here you can see the average sentiment in all other countries. If its goal is to buy the world's love, it would seem China is failing. Setting aside the unique problems with Chinese foreign investment, if there were anywhere it could win hearts and minds with raw dollars and cents, small developing nations like the Maldives would be that place. China's economy is 3,680 times larger. Building the nation's first major bridge, connecting 2 highly trafficked islands, seems like an easy way to make a friend. Elsewhere, the situation is much more grim. In democracies across Europe and North America, a consistent 70 to 80% of the public has a negative perception of China overall. It's perhaps the one issue on which both American Democrats and Republicans largely agree. In other words, it's hard not to conclude that, frankly, China isn't all that great at making friends. Why? In 2017, there were just 58 gun-related crimes in all of China, according to official government sources. There are good cultural reasons for the country's widespread suspicion of guns in particular. English, as you may know, is phonetic, meaning each letter represents a sound. Without background knowledge of the language, you can't guess what a word means merely by looking at it. You can only guess how it sounds. Chinese, on the other hand, is ideographic, meaning each character is built by combining and arranging what are called radicals, Lego bricks which themselves have more basic meanings. Understand those basic building blocks and you can, in many cases, guess what a character means. The one for safe, for example, is composed of the one meaning woman below the one meaning roof. Sometimes deconstructing a character like this reveals something interesting. This, for instance, is the Chinese character for gun. It's composed of 3 radicals: tree and person, representing man in harmony with nature, and a 3rd foreign radical which throws off this balance, suggesting that in Chinese, guns are considered a very unnatural object. To the extent that language shapes our thinking, you could say that Chinese speakers are predisposed to be wary of guns. The language itself isn't neutral. Okay, so all of that was made up. Yes, this is the character for gun, but the rest is pure nonsense. In fact, Chinese isn't even purely ideographic, but that's the subject for another day. If you bought that cultural explanation, don't feel bad. I've done similarly. But hopefully, it forces us to do some reflecting. When non-Chinese audiences observe a difference, any difference, between China and our home countries, we are not, it should go without saying, neutral scientists observing a field experiment. We carry our own baggage and biases. Now, you might think this bias would lead us to assume others are exactly like us, that because we think or act a certain way, other people on the other side of the world would too. But what often happens is actually the opposite. We, usually for very understandable reasons, overcorrect, assuming other people are fundamentally different. And in doing so, we downplay our overwhelming similarities. In trying to appreciate cultural diversity, we accidentally overlook the much simpler and sometimes true explanations, like that gun crimes are rare in China because gun ownership is highly restricted. So often are Confucius stereotypes about filial piety and saving face invoked as explanations for cultural differences that has become kind of a running joke. If Xi Jinping slips on a banana peel, you can bet someone will dig up a passage from Sun Tzu's Art of War to explain it. This, for instance, is a serious analysis from a reputable newspaper about the, quote, true meaning of the Chinese chairman drinking from 2 cups of tea at the National People's Congress. The danger in overanalyzing these details is not just that they can lead you astray, but also that they risk exoticizing others, portraying Chinese people as a different kind of human altogether. I say all that as one giant caveat, a warning before we proceed. It's possible, I believe, both not to over-rely on cultural explanations and believe that history has some bearing on the future. It was with this skepticism that I discovered Howard French's book, Everything Under the Heavens, which traces thousands of years of Chinese history to understand its actions today. Surprisingly, I found it quite convincing. What if, it suggests, China's inability to make allies was the result of something much deeper? What if the entire way we, say in America, think about foreign policy was neither neutral nor universal? China never thought of itself as a country in the same way that we think of that term today. China was a loosely defined, mythologized, and borderless concept. Even as it was politically fragmented during the Warring States period around 400 BC, there was an unquestioned assumption that it was destined for unity. It was believed that one government, the most legitimate of them, would ultimately prevail. The idea that multiple independent and equal states could emerge was never considered a serious possibility. And because China was seen as more than a mere country, it was necessarily above all others who were. This extremely hierarchical conception of the world defined everyone outside of China as what roughly translates to barbarian. So pervasive was this sense of cultural superiority that it largely prevented the import of foreign ideas and technologies. After all, why go abroad when you already live in the pinnacle of human civilization? Chinese history is filled with examples of comical levels of pettiness. Foreign diplomats were not only expected but required to kowtow to the emperor, literally kneeling before him with one's forehead touching the ground. When King George III sent Lord Macartney to China in 1793 to negotiate on behalf of the British Empire, the Chinese attached to his boat a banner announcing he was, quote, bearing tribute to the emperor. Total subservience was simply the price of admission, however, granting only the right to plead one's case before the royal court. Maintaining this tribute system wasn't only politically costly, it was also just plain expensive. In some cases, historians note that China probably spent more resources granting other nations the right to trade than it received in return. Not only were foreign envoys transported and housed at great expense, but they were always showered with gifts of greater value than they brought, demonstrating the generosity and grandeur of China. Travelers even learned they could pretend to be official diplomats and receive free room and board in Beijing. If Chinese officials knew this, they didn't care. The point wasn't to secure trade agreements so much as collect endorsements. These gifts, in turn, were flaunted to the Chinese public as evidence of their greatness. As long as foreigners were deferential to the royal court, they could be sure its claim to power was credible. Now, skeptical as I was that this 1,000-year-old tribute system has any relevance whatsoever in today's modern China, there are some suspicious parallels in the way it treats other countries, especially less powerful ones. In 2010, the country's foreign minister unambiguously declared, in frustration, "China is a big country, and you are small countries, and that is a fact." Further evidence can be found in the Philippines. In 2016, a UN tribunal ruled against China's vast claims to the South China Sea, handing the Philippines a long-awaited victory in protecting its sovereign rights to the waters off its western coast. That same year, however, Rodrigo Duterte won the Philippine presidency and immediately began a Chinese rapprochement. There was nothing subtle about it. "I will set aside the arbitral ruling," he said, and later, "Bye-bye, America, prepare to leave the Philippines." His first trip as president was to Beijing, itself unprecedented, where he publicly requested a three-way alliance with Russia and China. It was an extremely risky realignment. The voting public prefers the US to China, and ceding control of the South China Sea meant jeopardizing the source of roughly a third of its fishing industry. And for all this, his administration was rewarded with almost nothing. Chinese ships continued to harass Filipino fishermen, even in one case nearly killing them after ramming a boat. Few of the promised infrastructure projects ever came to fruition, eventually pushing Duterte back to the US in the final years of his presidency. Time and time again, countries that try to befriend China eventually come to the conclusion that it's simply not worth it. In Sri Lanka and the Maldives, corrupt infrastructure projects breed domestic discontent. Smaller countries across Southeast Asia are bullied. They're expected to do what's in their neighbor's interest even when they receive nothing in return. Even what are traditionally thought of as China's allies, North Korea and Russia, see the limits of its support. Despite pretending otherwise, Beijing has largely kept its distance from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, for example, speaking of it only in the vaguest of terms. Perhaps what we should worry about is not China's influence, its ability to make and keep friends, thereby upending the American-led order, but the influence of history on China. As we saw earlier, cultural explanations can only go so far, and neither is history destined to repeat itself. But to the extent that Chinese politicians look to the past for reference or guidance, they may view the world as a zero-sum game. The 21st century, this theory suggests, will not feature a Soviet-style ideological battle, but rather a good old-fashioned battle.